Morning, everyone. I'm Erica Freudenberger, the Outreach Engagement and Marketing Consultant at SALS, and I'm really excited to work with everybody on the next stage of your strategic plan. As you can see, we're past the halfway point and have covered a lot of ground, so give yourselves a huge round of applause. We began with an overview of the strategic planning process, and when we did that, we talked about why we plan, putting together a planning committee to help get this work done, the difference between traditional and engaged planning. We then worked on a landscape review, looking at the types of qualitative and quantitative data that we need to collect in order to create our strategic plan. During our last session, we practiced some tools to help us gather qualitative data, or what we call public knowledge. Today, we're going to be looking at the qualitative and quantitative data we've collected to learn more about our community and to shape our strategic plan. So during this session, I'm going to give an overview of how we identify themes that have arisen in the public knowledge we've collected. We're going to discuss how to use quantitative data, and that includes the census, our circulation, and usage data from our libraries. And all of that is to ensure that we have a good representation of your community in your qualitative data. You're also going to have some time to review the data you've collected through public knowledge and identify any themes that may be emerging. So far, we've reviewed why we're doing community-based planning. To sum it up in a nutshell, we do this because it's a requirement of the New York State Division of Library Development to maintain a charter as a public library. It also creates a roadmap to the future for your organization, and it incorporates what really matters to people's lives and their aspirations for the future. Your plan will establish how the library defines success and how it's going to ensure that it's going to meet the goals it's outlined in the plan. And finally, it communicates to the public how the work the library does benefits the community. At the end of the first session, your homework was to form a planning committee to try the SOAR exercise. At this point, you should have a planning committee in place and have everybody contributing to your community resource plan. In our second session, we discussed the landscape review process, which incorporates both internal and external data. Your homework was to pull together demographic information about your community, including who lives there and whether it's growing or contracting, library statistics that reflect how your community is using the library, and that could be things like circulation, the number of visits you have every year, program attendance, the number of programs, all that kind of stuff. You also want to figure out what key stakeholders in your community are working on, which may require reaching out to other groups in town to see what they're prioritizing as a focus for the next couple of years. And finally, and one of the biggest things you can do is to find out what your municipality's priorities are. And a really great way to do this is to look at your municipality's comprehensive plan, which they also have to complete every 5 years or so. During our last session, we practiced using some community engagement tools to collect public knowledge. We used tools developed by the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation, the Ask exercise, which is used with individuals, and the Aspirations exercise, which is used with groups of people who are currently working together and will continue to work together towards a common goal. Your homework after the last session was to try the tools with at least 3 people. And as you're in the process of gathering what may seem to be a bunch of somewhat random information, you may be wondering what it is you're going to do with all of that. And that's what we're going to talk about today. First, I want to talk a little bit about what we call collecting public knowledge, which is also known as qualitative data. The reason we spent some time doing this is because we want your strategic plans to be rooted in what matters to people and to be able to identify what key issues your community is facing and how people are talking about it. This is what the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation calls turning outward. We are spending time gathering information so that we become more intentional in our choices, so that when we step forward to create change, we can have greater impact and increase our relevance and significance in the communities we serve. I want to acknowledge that this is not how most organizations operate. We tend to rely on expert knowledge and make decisions based on what we know as professionals, which may or may not resonate with people. It can be really difficult to get people to mobilize around expert knowledge. They don't feel like they have any stake in it because it's not necessarily something that matters to them. It can also be incredibly difficult to let go of expert knowledge when we realize that what we thought or what we are currently doing may not, in fact, be the right thing for our community. So I just want to acknowledge that this work can be challenging on many levels, and I applaud all of you for being willing to give it a try. In our last session, we discussed the importance of capturing what matters to people in the language that they are using. What people say and how they say it tells us a lot about what matters to them. You want to be sure as you do this work that you're not taking what people say and putting it into your own words or overlaying your own bias. As you collect public knowledge, you're going to start thinking about how it can inform the work you do at your library or organization and begin identifying who's best suited to address particular issues and to set priorities. So back many years ago, when I did this in a small community, we heard a lot about safety, and I have to admit I was really confused. The community that I was serving at the library was a place where nobody locked their doors, right? We're, in a rural area in the Hudson Valley. I didn't really know what people meant by safety. And so when we asked and we dug a little bit deeper, it turns out it was actually about the town's only stoplight, which was at the intersection of two major county routes. It turns out that the timing loop had broken several decades ago, and the mayor at that time had a falling out with the guy at the Department of Transportation, so it never got fixed. And here's the thing about small towns. No one ever forgets anything. So even though the mayor had changed since that initial incident, the same guy was at the Department of Transportation, and he was determined to not fix the stoplight. But the broken stoplight was leading to these huge backups of traffic, which meant people were avoiding the light by zipping through the village's side streets, which incidentally do not have any sidewalks. So when people talked about safety, they meant traffic safety because children and others were getting hit by cars all too frequently. I share this story to stress the importance of having these conversations. And I just want to say here, I know how much easier it would be to use the questions that we're talking about in a survey or to put them on your website and have people just fill out a survey or respond through Google Forms. But if we had used a survey, all we would have known is that people wanted a safe community, but not that what they meant by that is that the stoplight needed fixing. So while talking to people takes a fair amount of time and is much more high touch than sending out a survey to your residents, and it may also move us, for those of us who are introverts, out of our comfort zone, it is important on several levels because A, it allows us to find out what really matters to people, and B, it helps us build relationships with people as we do this work, which pays off in tons of ways down the road. But asking people to share what matters to them and what they want to see happen can be really tricky. We didn't just hear about the stoplight. We also heard that people wanted sidewalks and a sewer and a bunch of other stuff. And as a public library, we're not in a position to have sidewalks built or pass a referendum to install a sewer in the village. What we could do is notify the appropriate stakeholders. And in this case of the sidewalks, it was the town. And for the sewer, it was the village. And let them know what people were saying and how they were talking about it. The result was that people stepped forward to write a grant on behalf of the town to install sidewalks. After having a 2010 sewer referendum defeated, the village managed to pass a referendum to fund a sewer in 2017 because they were able to reframe the argument in language that resonated with people by using the language that people had talked about during our information gathering process. And it was language that everybody understood and that made sense to them. And I just want to take a step back here and say that I really want to be clear that as you're collecting public knowledge, you're doing just that. You're collecting data. It doesn't mean that you have to take action on absolutely everything you hear, because you're going to hear lots of stuff that's out of your wheelhouse. But there may be ways to help accomplish some things that you hadn't considered. When we told our mayor about the stoplight, he explained this situation with the Department of Transportation. We asked him if it would be okay if we let people who had expressed their frustration with this know who to contact at the Department of Transportation, and to give them his name and number, and ask them and say, like, hey, you mentioned that this was important to you. If it is, here's the person to call who can actually do something about it. The mayor agreed and shared that contact information for the man at the Department of Transportation, and we shared the information with people who had expressed concern. And guess what? People started calling him. At first, it was like 1 or 2 calls, but there was also a Facebook page called We Hate the Stoplight, and when we posted on that, the calls began in earnest. In 2 weeks, there was a crew at the intersection fixing the timing loop that had been broken for 2 decades. And I share this story not to praise the library, but to show that we can help people be the heroes of their own story. That success was what led people to look around and see what else they could do. And that's how grants got written, and eventually even some planning laws got changed, all because of the input we had gathered from the community. It also changed the way people viewed the library. They understood that we were deeply committed to the community and would work to ensure that it flourished so that we could as well. So that's where this work can lead. But to begin, we have to be able to make sense of all the information we collected. And I know that this can be overwhelming because, like in our case, we spent 8 months collecting public knowledge and we had a ton of data. I created an Excel spreadsheet, and I organized it into the following categories that you can see on the screen. But I had to say, like, once we printed it out, like, it was spread like on the walls all the way down the hallway. That's how much information we had. So I understand that this can be a little bit overwhelming in the beginning. And certainly, like, if this is not what makes sense to you, organize it however it does. This is how I did it. I broke it down into categories of aspirations, main concerns, specific issue concerns, actions that could make a difference, and then finally, who people identified that they could trust to take action on issues. I then plugged all the information from each of the exercises and conversations that we had into one of these categories. The next step was to get together and meet with everyone who had been doing this work, and that's anybody who would help with the Ask and Aspirations tools, including any facilitators and note takers, as well as the full planning committee. We reviewed the spreadsheet together, first to make sure that we'd accurately captured what we had each heard, and then began to identify themes. How did we do it? So we did that by beginning the conversation by discussing our experiences of doing this work, what we saw, what we heard, and how it felt. We then spent 15 minutes silently working through the sheet so that we could each identify we could each figure out what we thought the themes were, and to make notes of that, and then come back together to compare notes to figure out whether or not we were all on the same page. And this is the point of the planning process in which you have an opportunity to consider whether or not you've gained enough information. Like, are clear themes emerging, or do you need to get more information? And I understand that may not make you feel happy, but you may have to do that. And it gets hard because you have to really honestly assess what you have. And I know it can be really difficult to admit that you have to go out and collect more information, but unless you are completely confident that you can speak with authority to your community about what matters to it, I would make the time to get enough information. It's really important that when you report out to people what you heard, that it resonates with them. If you do have enough information, begin the discussion about what jumped out at you that was important to people. And make note if people are identifying the same thing, and find out the themes that everybody's agreeing on. At this stage, you can just work with really broad themes. You don't want to get too specific because you're putting together information to create kind of an overarching narrative of what matters to people. As you're looking at these 6 categories identified on the previous slide, ask the group, what do you see? What are people trying to tell us? And how do the ideas and concepts fit together? As you put together this information, look at the themes that emerge and begin to identify and pull out the larger themes. Once you've determined the themes, you can begin to unravel the story, and every community has a narrative or story. So the community that I was serving, the narrative initially had been, no one wants to come here. And I didn't think that was true, but that was the story the community had been telling about itself. I think it's really helpful to know what the existing community narrative is, because it's going to help you put the work that you're doing in context. But at the same time, you can't allow it to define the story you're uncovering. So my experience was that my community had a false narrative and that we could help tell a different story and create a different outcome. And the way to do that is to look at the themes you've uncovered and figure out how they fit together. What's the real story of our community? What would it like to be? And how does it think it can get there? It's okay to try out different stories to describe what's going on and to weigh those against what you've learned about the community. And I just want to be really clear about this one point. There's no one story that's going to explain everything that's happening. Communities are really complex ecosystems that have multiple stories happening simultaneously. This is a chance to identify a couple of the most important stories to your community. And that's where it might get tricky. What you want to do at this point is focus on no more than 3 of the larger, more important stories. Don't discard the others. You may want to return to them, but to make some headway, you're really going to need to make some strategic decisions about which stories you're going to be telling moving forward. You might also notice that some stories are intertwined, and to tell them successfully and to reach the outcome your community desires, different stakeholders will have roles to play in helping the story move forward. It's not up to you, as I mentioned before, to address all of the issues raised by a community's narrative. You have to be really careful to not do this part of the work alone. You really need to do this as a team and make sure that everybody has a chance to contribute and that everybody's voice is heard. This is a process that might take a bit of time, so you're going to want to schedule at least an hour to work on this. You're looking to clarify what people said and honor their input. And please remember, this is not about you, the library, or your organization. It really is about what people are talking about, what matters to them, and what you've heard and what people have said may not be what you think about the community. But please don't reshape the narrative to fit, reshape the story to fit your narrative, right? You really want to tell the community story, not your own. So once you think you have the story, you can test it out by using this community narrative kind of plug and play thing. And this is going to be really familiar to any of you who have used the Aspirations Facilitators Guide or led an Aspirations exercise, because you try and do this at the end of every exercise to ensure that you have accurately captured information. As you fill this out, ask yourself if it makes sense. Does the story resonate with what you've heard? And if you went up to a group of strangers in your community and told them that this is what matters to them, would they agree with you and would they believe you? If you can answer yes to those questions, awesome. You're ready for the next step, which is sharing what you've learned. As you think about sharing the information you've gathered, keep in mind that you are a steward of public knowledge and that you want to use the information you've collected to create positive change in your community. People have trusted you with personal information, but it's not yours. It belongs to the community, so please share it, although you don't want to be like willy-nilly sprinkling it all over randomly. As you begin thinking about sharing what you've learned, you also want to consider the implications for your work and the role of your library in the community. I would suggest that you use the knowledge sensitively. Not everyone needs the same information, right? When we heard about the traffic light, our first step wasn't to go immediately to the public. We went to the mayor to let him know what people were saying. It was an infrastructure issue, which falls under his authority. It was only when he reported back to us that he wasn't having any luck with the Department of Transportation that we thought about what the next steps could be, which included letting the public know who to call. We worked with the mayor. He provided the contact information and approved the idea of putting that information out to the public. We didn't do it on our own. When you start thinking about sharing what you've learned, you're going to want to think about who you're going to tell it to and how you present it. As you share public knowledge, you want to do so in a neutral space so that nobody feels that they're being criticized or under attack. If you're approaching a group like a town board or the Rotary, you'll want to host a conversation where you share what you've learned and its importance, and then work with that group to identify what the implications for the community might be and what people are taking away from the conversation. Be careful not to get into the details of the conversations you had. You really want to focus on the broader themes and implications so that the work can continue to move forward. You're looking to create a larger circle of people to address the public knowledge, and you want them to be able to think about how to use the information you've gathered and how to move the community forward. And finally, you'll want to share what you've learned with the broad community. You want to show that something's happening from the work that you've been doing, and that reflects their input. In all of these follow-up conversations, focus on we, right? The community, not the library or a specific organization. This is not the time to plan specific initiatives. That can come in follow-up conversations, but rather share the information that you've gathered and the importance of what people said. Focus on the big picture and possibility. It's also a chance to think creatively about how you can share what you've learned and leverage both informal and formal networks. You could hold a community potluck. You can write a press release or create a social media campaign. Just remember, be strategic, be ethical, and help your community move from problems to possibilities. The final step is to move from learning to taking action on what you've heard, because in the end, that's what this is all about. You'll want to meet with groups that showed interest in the work you've done when you reported out and review the key takeaways that have emerged from the community's story. Different stories are going to resonate with different people and groups, so be strategic when you approach people about taking action. And don't try and do everything at once, right? Like, this is a strategic plan meant to take place over years. You don't need to get it all done in the first week. So when you have a meeting with a person or organization you've identified as being able to take action on an issue, ask them, who else needs to know what we're learning? How can we apply what we're learning to our work? And where can we best get started? Excuse me. Chances are you're going to need to build capacity to move forward, which means you may have groups of people moving in different directions, right? That happens sometimes. You're going to need to build capacity to meet the priorities you set, but you need to figure out a way for people to stay connected and report back as they go off to take on different pieces of what has been said and reported. This is a really incredible opportunity for the library to position itself as a convener and facilitator of conversation. So as you're thinking strategically about what action you want to take, I recommend that you begin with a quick win that doesn't take too much planning. You want to find something that's going to inspire people to take action and that also builds momentum so that you can do larger, more complex things. Beginning with a quick win shouldn't need too much planning. It's just something to kind of like really get people going, and also to keep in mind that you can't create change unless you take meaningful strategic action. So as you continue to do this work, Please keep in mind that you are a steward of public knowledge. There's an ethical responsibility that accompanies that to use and share the information that you've gathered in a way that helps your community create possibilities and outcomes that they've identified as being important to them. And have fun with it. I know that this work is really demanding and takes a lot of time and attention, but it's also incredibly gratifying. So for your next step, because of course I'm giving you homework, please continue to build your asset map, collect public knowledge, and once you've talked with a statistically significant number of people, begin analyzing your data, both qualitative and quantitative. So thank you so much for your interest in strategic planning. If you have questions or need help with the process, please reach out and let me know. I'm here to help you every step of the way. Have a terrific day.